Chapter 1. The Call of the Wild. The air hung thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. A familiar embrace as I, Mark Anderson, pulled my battered Ford truck to a stop before the weathered entrance sign of Blackwood National Park. It was May 6, 2025, and at 26 years old, the gleaming ranger badge pinned to my chest felt like a sacred talisman, the culmination of a childhood spent dreaming beneath endless Montana skies. I sat there, engine idling, for nearly 20 minutes, not out of nerves but in reverence, savoring the weight of the moment. The sign above me, its paint chipped and faded from decades of harsh winters, bore the park's name in bold letters, flanked by a carved silhouette of a grizzly bear. Beneath it, a smaller plaque read, "Established 1912. My fingers traced the badge on my uniform, its sharp edges grounding me as I whispered to myself, "You're officially late for your first day." A grin tugged at my lips, and I turned the key, the engine roaring back to life as I rolled toward my new beginning. The main ranger station emerged from the trees like a relic of the wild, a sturdy wooden structure with a sloped roof, its dark logs blending seamlessly into the towering pines that surrounded it. It was exactly as I'd seen on the National Park Service website, a postcard-perfect image of wilderness authority, with a wide porch adorned with hanging flower baskets that swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and coffee, a faint crackle of a radio echoing from the back office. Chief Ranger Davis met me at the front desk, his presence as imposing as the mountains themselves. His handshake was firm, almost bruising, and his gray eyes scanned me with the scrutiny of a man who'd been patrolling these woods since before I was born. "Anderson, good. Your uniform fits," he said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of decades in the service. He stood at least 6'2", his broad shoulders filling out his own uniform, the creases sharp despite years of wear. I nodded, suppressing the urge to beam like a kid on Christmas morning, and he thrust a thick binder into my hands, its cover embossed with the park's logo. "Park protocols. Memorize them," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. His gruffness couldn't dim the fire in my chest as I followed him through the station, my boots echoing on the polished wooden floor. For the first month, I shadowed Ranger Wilson, a wiry woman in her late 30s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a sharp eye for detail. She had a habit of chewing on the end of a pencil when deep in thought, her brow furrowed as she pointed out the nuances of the park's terrain on a topographic map pinned to the wall. "Listen more than you talk," Davis had instructed, and I took it to heart, absorbing every word Wilson spoke as we patrolled the trails together. Those early days passed in a blur of trail maps, wildlife catalogs, and visitor interactions, families asking about the best spots for fishing, backpackers seeking permits for the backcountry, and the occasional lost hiker who'd strayed too far from the marked paths. I learned the rhythm of the park, the way the sun filtered through the canopy at dawn, casting golden streaks across the forest floor, and how the wind carried the distant howl of a wolf at dusk. My off hours became my sanctuary, a sacred ritual of exploration that deepened my bond with Blackwood. I hiked every path in my assigned northern sector, sometimes twice, mapping the land with the precision of a cartographer possessed. The sector stretched across 15 square miles of rugged terrain, from the rocky cliffs of Maple Ridge to the serene meadows near Aspen Grove. I noted which creeks swelled fastest after a spring rain, their waters churning with sediment as they carved new channels through the earth. I memorized which meadows burst into bloom with the first whisper of spring, their wildflowers a riot of yellow and purple that attracted clouds of butterflies. I tracked where elk gathered to graze at dusk, their antlers silhouetted against the fading light as they moved with a quiet grace through the tall grass. In a worn leather notebook, I recorded details most rangers would dismiss as trivial. The specific chirp of a western tanager, a bright flash of red and yellow flitting through the pines, the velvety texture of mosses clinging to ancient boulders, their shades of green shifting with the moisture in the air, the way certain slopes felt beneath my boots, their angles and textures as distinct as fingerprints. I sketched the patterns of lichen on tree trunks, the way they spread like ancient maps across the bark, and jotted down the scent of the forest after a rain, a sharp, clean aroma that mingled with the musk of wet soil. By the end of my first year, I could navigate that terrain blindfolded. A skill Wilson tested one crisp November morning. She led me half a mile into the woods, a bandana tied tightly over my eyes, her hand steady on my elbow as she guided me over uneven ground. The air was cold, my breath visible in the morning chill, and I focused on the sounds around me. The crunch of pine needles underfoot, the faint trickle of a nearby stream, the rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted through the underbrush. When she finally stopped, she removed the bandana, revealing a clearing I recognized immediately. "Point to Maple Ridge Trail," she said, her tone challenging. I turned, orienting myself by the feel of the ground. A slight depression we'd crossed about 100 yards back, the seasonal creek bed that ran parallel to the trail. I pointed north, and she nodded, a rare smile breaking through her usual stoicism. "Not bad, Anderson. Within 20 yards. Most rookies would be screaming for their GPS by now." I brushed dirt from my pants, the pride swelling in my chest as I caught the flicker of approval in her eyes. "The ground tells you everything you need to know," I said, trying to sound nonchalant despite the thrill of her validation. Chapter 2. The First Unease. Autumn of that first year brought a shift, a subtle disturbance in the rhythm I'd come to know. I was hiking near Aspen Grove, a quiet section of the park where the trees grew sparse and the ground was carpeted with ferns, their fronds curling in the cool air. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. As I knelt to examine a patch of mushrooms, small white caps with gills as delicate as spider silk, I noticed something peculiar. A circle of ferns, perfectly withered, as if scorched by an unseen hand. The circle was precise, about 6 feet in diameter. The ferns within it reduced to brittle, gray husks, while those just outside remained vibrant and green. I leaned closer, expecting the acrid scent of herbicide or the telltale signs of human interference. Boot prints, a discarded can, anything. But there was nothing. No chemical stench, no footprints, only a silence that seemed to press against my ears, heavier than the usual hum of the forest. I ran my fingers over the dead ferns, their texture like ash, and a chill crept up my spine, unbidden. "Probably just a fungus," Wilson suggested later that day when I mentioned it over coffee in the break room. She leaned back in her chair, her boots propped on the edge of the table, a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Nature does weird sometimes. You'll see plenty of oddities the longer you're here." Her tone was casual, but I caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or unease. She was right, I told myself, forcing a nod as I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. I'd studied enough ecology to know that fungi could create such patterns. Fairy rings, they called them, where mushrooms drained the soil of nutrients, leaving a perfect circle of dead grass or plants. But this felt different. There were no mushrooms here, no visible spores, just an absence of life that seemed too deliberate, too perfect. That circle gnawed at me, a splinter in my mind I couldn't dislodge. 2 weeks later, I returned to Aspen Grove, my boots crunching through the first fallen leaves of the season. The air was crisp, the scent of decay mingling with the sharpness of pine, and I half expected to find the circle unchanged, a silent monument to my unease. But it was gone. New growth had erased all trace, the ferns now a uniform sea of green, their fronds swaying gently in the breeze. It was as if the earth had healed itself overnight, swallowing the anomaly whole. I stood there, staring at the spot, my notebook open in my hands, the pencil hovering over a blank page. The forest seemed to watch me, the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a raven the only sounds breaking the stillness. I wrote nothing, the absence of evidence more unsettling than the circle itself. Other oddities began to surface, small things that most would overlook but that stood out to me like cracks in a mirror. One morning, as I patrolled the northern sector, the birds fell silent in unison, their songs cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. I froze mid-step, my hand resting on the trunk of a pine, the rough bark biting into my palm. The forest held its breath, the air heavy with an unspoken tension, and I scanned the canopy for a hawk or an owl, some predator that might explain the sudden quiet. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of branches and the faint whisper of wind. The silence lasted nearly a minute before a single chickadee chirped, tentative at first, then joined by others as the forest exhaled. I jotted the moment in my notebook, the date and time circled in red ink, though I couldn't say why it felt significant. A week later, I noticed a coyote pack abandoning their den mid-season, a behavior so unusual it sent me flipping through my wildlife manuals for an explanation. The den, a shallow burrow beneath a rocky outcrop near Maple Ridge, had been a hub of activity for months. Pups yipping at dawn, adults returning with fresh kills. But one morning, as I passed by on patrol, the den was empty, the surrounding soil unmarked by their usual tracks. I followed their trail for half a mile, expecting to find a new den site, but the tracks simply stopped at the edge of a clearing, as if the pack had vanished into thin air. Coyotes didn't behave this way. They were territorial, predictable in their patterns. I crouched by the last set of prints, my fingers brushing the soil, and felt that same chill from Aspen Grove creeping up my spine. Around the campfire during training week, the senior rangers gathered under a sky pricked with stars, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The air smelled of wood smoke and whiskey, the latter passed around in a dented flask that had seen more seasons than I had. Ranger Mitchell, a grizzled man with a scar running down his left cheek, leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You ever been up to Blackwater Ridge at dusk?" he asked, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Hikers say they feel watched. Eyes in the trees, they call it." The others nodded, a knowing ripple through the group, their shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. I poked at the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night. "That's just wilderness psychology," I countered, my tone light but firm. "People get spooked without streetlights or cell service. They project their fears onto the woods." Mitchell shrugged, taking a swig from the flask before passing it to Wilson. "Maybe, or maybe there are things in these woods older than the Park Service." His words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke, and I laughed them off, chalking it up to Ranger folklore. A way to pass the long nights and haze the new guy. After a year at Blackwood, I'd seen nothing science couldn't explain, nothing that couldn't be cataloged in my notebook with a rational footnote. But as I stared into the flames, the memory of that withered circle flickered in my mind, unbidden. Chapter 3, The Rising Shadow. My second and third years at Blackwood unfolded with the steady rhythm of routine, each season painting the park in new shades of beauty and challenge. I earned my own patrol routes, winding paths that took me deep into the backcountry where the air was sharp with the scent of cedar and the ground was littered with pine cones the size of my fist. I led search and rescue trainings, teaching new rangers how to read the subtle signs of a lost hiker. A broken twig, a scuff mark on a rock, the faint imprint of a boot in the mud. My nature talks became a park staple, drawing crowds of visitors who stayed awake through my descriptions of the park's ecosystem. From the symbiotic relationship between fungi and tree roots to the migratory patterns of the red-tailed hawks that soared overhead. I became known as the ranger who could identify any plant or animal track with a glance, a reputation that earned me the occasional nod from Davis, a rare accolade that felt like a medal pinned to my chest. But my fourth year brought a darkness that seeped into the park like a slow fog, obscuring the clarity I'd come to rely on. It began with the spring thaw, the snowmelt revealing more than just the first wildflowers. In a ravine near Blackwater Ridge, a team of rangers found a backpack, its canvas faded and torn, belonging to a hiker reported missing the previous fall. The pack was empty save for a waterlogged journal, its pages smeared with ink but still legible enough to confirm the owner's identity. A 23-year-old named Daniel Harper, last seen hiking solo near the northern caves. The discovery sent a ripple through the station, a reminder of the wilderness's indifference, but it was only the beginning. June brought a family to the station, their faces pale with panic as they reported their teenage son, Ethan, missing from their campsite overnight. They'd been staying at Pinewood Campground, a popular spot for families with its easy access to hiking trails and a shallow creek perfect for wading. Ethan, 16, had gone to bed in their tent, his sleeping bag zipped tight against the chilly night air, but by morning, he was gone. His shoes remained by the tent flap, his jacket still hanging on a nearby branch, and the only sign of his departure was a single set of barefoot prints leading into the woods. Prints that stopped abruptly 50 yards from the campsite, as if he'd been lifted off the ground. We searched for 3 days, combing the area with K9 units and thermal imaging drones, but found nothing. The family left the park in tears, their hope dwindling with each passing hour, and I added Ethan's name to the growing list in my notebook, the red ink stark against the white page. By August, the tally of missing persons had climbed to 6, more than the previous 3 years combined. Each case followed a similar pattern, a hiker or camper vanishing without a trace, their belongings left behind as if they'd simply stepped out of their lives. The disappearances were spread across the park, from the dense forests near Ridgeline Point to the open meadows of Oak Grove, but they shared a haunting consistency. No signs of struggle, no evidence of wildlife, just an absence that felt deliberate, orchestrated. I was there when we found the third missing hiker, a woman named Clara Bennett, or rather what remained of her. Her body lay at the base of a cliff near Maple Ridge, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her face frozen in an expression of terror that made my stomach churn. The official report cited animal predation, likely a bear, noting the deep gashes across her torso and the scattered bones picked clean by scavengers. But I'd studied bear attacks in detail. Part of my training included analyzing attack patterns, from the claw marks to the bite radius, and this didn't match. Bear attacks were messy, driven by hunger or defense, leaving clear signs of feeding. Bite marks on major muscle groups, drag marks where the animal had moved the body. Clara's wounds were precise, almost surgical, the gashes too uniform, too deep, as if made by something with a calculated intent rather than instinct. I kept that observation to myself after seeing Davis's reaction to another ranger, a rookie named Carter, who'd voiced a similar doubt during a briefing. "We deal in facts, not speculation," Davis snapped, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Bear populations are up this year, and hikers are getting careless with food storage. I don't want to hear alternatives that might panic visitors." His gaze landed on me as he spoke, a silent warning, and I swallowed my words, the weight of his authority pressing down like a stone. A week later, a memo arrived, its language clinical and detached, outlining new safety protocols. Mandatory partner patrols, enhanced communication check-ins, and expanded restricted areas around cave systems and certain remote trails, including Ridgeline Cave and the northern caves near Blackwater Ridge. The email cited revised best practices, a euphemism that avoided any mention of the disappearances, as if acknowledging them might give them power. I read it in the break room, the fluorescent light flickering overhead, casting jagged shadows on the linoleum floor. Wilson entered, her boots scuffing against the tiles, and caught me staring at the memo, my jaw tight. "You buying the bear theory?" she asked, her voice low despite the empty room, her eyes sharp as she poured coffee into her faded park logo mug. I hesitated, the memory of Clara's body flashing in my mind. "Not entirely," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression unreadable as she stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. "I've been here 12 years. Never seen a cluster like this." Davis asked me to transfer some old incident reports to digital last month. Found some interesting patterns going back decades. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "What kind of patterns?" She glanced toward the door, her movements deliberate, as if she expected someone to be listening. 7-year cycles, increased missing persons, unusual animal behavior, then nothing for years. Always around the same areas, caves, ridges, remote spots. I thought back to the withered fern circle from 3 years earlier, its perfect symmetry, the way it had vanished. "You think there's something else happening?" I asked, my voice tight. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway made her pause. When Davis entered, his presence filling the small room, she shifted seamlessly to a different topic. "So that's how you reset the emergency radio if it malfunctions," she said, her tone casual as she demonstrated with the radio on the counter. I played along, nodding. "Got it. Thanks for the tip." But her words lingered, a shadow that followed me into the woods. Chapter 4. the cave's whisper. Despite the new buddy system requirement, I still took solo hikes on my days off, my ranger badge tucked into my pocket, my uniform replaced by civilian clothes, a faded flannel shirt, jeans, and hiking boots worn soft from years of use. I told myself it was to maintain my familiarity with the terrain, to keep my senses sharp, but the truth was simpler. I'd always preferred solitude in nature, the quiet companionship of the trees and the wind. One October morning, I set out for Ridgeline Point, a remote overlook 7 miles from the nearest road, where the views stretched across the park in a patchwork of reds and golds as the maple leaves turned with the season. The trail was narrow, flanked by dense underbrush and ancient pines, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, dappled glow. I stopped to photograph a particularly vivid display of leaves, their colors so bright they seemed to glow against the evergreen backdrop, when I noticed something unusual in the soft soil beneath my feet. A set of tracks, bear-sized but wrong in every other way, stretched across the path. The prints were deep, the soil freshly disturbed, and I knelt to examine them, my camera forgotten in my hand. They had 5 forward-facing digits, almost hand-like, with a toe pattern that didn't match any wildlife in the park. Bears had a distinct gait, their paws leaving rounded prints with claw marks extending forward. But these were too precise, the digits too articulated, as if something had walked upright, mimicking a bear but failing to capture its essence. I took multiple pictures, zooming in on the prints from every angle, and measured them with a small ruler I kept in my pack. Each print was nearly 12 inches long, the depth suggesting a creature of significant weight. My mind raced through possibilities. An injured animal, its gait altered by pain, or perhaps a prankster with a carved mold, though the remoteness of the location made that unlikely. The tracks led toward Ridgeline Cave, a limestone formation that had been closed to the public years before I arrived, supposedly due to unstable internal structures. A heavy metal security gate blocked the entrance, its bars rusted but intact, a padlock securing it against intruders. As I approached the gate, strange sounds drifted from inside the cave, scratching, rhythmic and deliberate, mixed with a wet clicking noise I couldn't place, like someone rapidly tapping their tongue against the roof of their mouth, but amplified, echoing through the stone. I pressed my ear to the gate, the metal cold against my skin, and listened. Probably raccoons, I muttered to myself, or maybe a fox that had found another way in through a crevice. I made a mental note to file a maintenance request about possible wildlife accessing the restricted area, but something about the sounds held me there, my hand lingering on the gate. That night, I dreamed of dark tunnels and something moving just beyond my flashlight beam, a shadowy presence that watched me from the edges of my vision. Looking back now, I recognize that moment as the beginning, the first thread pulled in a sweater that would completely unravel. If I'd known what waited inside Ridgeline Cave, I might have requested a transfer, found another park where rangers only worried about littering tourists and the occasional wildfire. But I didn't know, and the curiosity that had defined my years at Blackwood pushed me forward. I hesitated at the gate, the padlock intact but the hinges on the left side rusted considerably, creating a gap at the bottom where smaller animals could squeeze through. Something in there was making those sounds, and if it was an injured animal, I couldn't leave it to suffer. Protocol dictated I should radio in my position, request backup, and wait, but I was off duty, technically a civilian hiker, and I knew Davis would order me away from the restricted area without hesitation. Just a quick look, I muttered to myself, pulling out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the morning mist. 5 minutes. I examined the gate more closely, the rust flaking under my touch as I tested the hinges. With enough pressure, the gate shifted about 8 inches, just enough for me to squeeze through sideways. I sucked in my stomach, my jacket catching briefly on the rough metal, and slipped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, at least 15 degrees cooler than outside, the air damp and heavy with the scent of minerals and decay. My breath formed small clouds in the beam of my flashlight, the light reflecting off the slick limestone walls that glistened with moisture. The main tunnel sloped downward, its ceiling low enough that I had to duck in places, the sound of dripping water echoing from deeper within, each drop a sharp punctuation in the stillness. I swept my light across the floor, finding the same unusual tracks continuing inside, their edges more defined in the soft cave soil, as if they'd been made mere hours ago. The sounds grew clearer now, a rhythmic scratching punctuated by that wet clicking noise, louder, more insistent, coming from deeper in the cave, past where the main tunnel curved out of sight. I should have turned back. Everything about this screamed warning, but 4 years of curiosity about Blackwood's oddities pushed me forward, one cautious step at a time. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly as it bounced off the walls, distorting into something unrecognizable, a mockery of my own words. I immediately regretted it, the echo amplifying my vulnerability. The scratching stopped abruptly, the silence that followed heavier than the sounds had been, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I moved forward, keeping my light aimed at the ground to avoid tripping on the uneven floor, the limestone slick beneath my boots. The main tunnel curved to the right, opening into a larger chamber, its ceiling soaring 20 feet above me, stalactites hanging like jagged teeth. My flashlight beam seemed to dim, swallowed by the vastness of the space, the light barely reaching the far walls. The air felt different here, denser, almost sticky in my lungs, as if the cave itself were breathing. The scratching resumed, but its pattern had changed, more deliberate now, as if whatever made it had noticed my presence and adjusted accordingly. "It's just an animal," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. "Probably trapped or injured." I took another step into the chamber, sweeping my light methodically from left to right, the beam catching limestone formations, water-carved columns and rippling curtains, their surfaces shimmering with moisture. Natural, normal, I told myself, clinging to the familiar. But then I noticed markings on some of the walls, not graffiti from trespassers, but deep grooves in sets of 5, as if something with massive claws had been sharpening them against the stone. The grooves were fresh, the limestone dust still clinging to the edges, and I traced one with my finger, the claw marks easily 3 inches deep. My pulse quickened, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The clicking grew louder, coming from the far corner where the chamber narrowed into another tunnel, a black maw that seemed to swallow the light entirely. I aimed my beam there and froze, my breath catching in my throat. Something massive moved in the darkness, a shape that my brain tried to categorize as a bear. The general size and bulk matched a large black bear, the kind I'd seen lumbering through the park on countless patrols. But as it shifted, stepping into the edge of my light, I realized how wrong that assumption was. Its proportions were distorted, grotesque. A neck stretched impossibly long, almost serpentine, supporting a head that seemed too small for its body, the skull narrow and pointed like a reptile's. Its limbs were too long, too thin, bending at angles that defied biology, and its eyes. Those eyes caught my flashlight beam and reflected back a sickly green, like toxic pools glowing in the darkness. The creature's head swiveled toward me with jerky, unnatural movements, as if its joints were controlled by strings, a marionette in the shape of a nightmare. The clicking sound came again, but I could now see it wasn't from its mouth. It emanated from somewhere in its throat, which bulged and contracted with each pulse, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a warning. For 3 horrifying seconds, we stared at each other, the creature's gaze unblinking, its eyes boring into mine with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. My training, years of protocol, hours of studying wildlife behavior, abandoned me, leaving only raw, primal fear. Then it moved. The charge happened faster than seemed possible for something that size, its limbs unfolding and folding in a loping gait that didn't match any animal I'd ever studied. One moment it was across the chamber, the next it was halfway to me, closing the distance with a speed that defied its bulk, its claws scraping against the stone floor, the sound a high-pitched screech that echoed through the cave. My survival instinct finally kicked in, adrenaline flooding my system as I turned and ran, the tunnel narrowing around me like a vice. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, creating disorienting shadows that danced on the walls, making the cave seem alive, writhing. Behind me, I heard the creature's bulk scraping against the stone, its claws scrabbling for purchase, the clicking now interspersed with a high-pitched wail that made my skin crawl. A sound that was both animal and something else, something I couldn't name. I fumbled for my service weapon before remembering I was off duty. My civilian holster still holding my Glock, but I couldn't stop to draw it, not with the sound of those claws gaining on me. The tunnel curved sharply, and I nearly crashed into the wall, my shoulder slamming hard against the limestone, sending a jolt of pain down my arm that made me gasp. The flashlight slipped from my grip, rolling away and plunging me into near-total darkness, the beam spinning wildly before coming to rest against a rock, illuminating a jagged stalagmite in a cruel mockery of light. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I oriented myself by running my hand along the wall, the slick stone cold against my palm. I moved as fast as I dared, my boots slipping on the damp floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. A faint glow ahead signaled the entrance, maybe 50 yards away, the promise of daylight a beacon pulling me forward. The creature's breathing sounded right behind me now, ragged and wet, nothing like a normal bear, its presence of physical weight pressing against my back. Something brushed against me, a sensation like rough leather dragging across my jacket, the contact brief but enough to make me stumble, my knees nearly buckling. I put on a final burst of speed, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. As the cave entrance grew brighter, the light a golden promise of safety, I threw myself through the gap in the gate, my body scraping against the rusted metal, and spun around immediately to slam it shut, the clang echoing through the forest as something large crashed against the other side. A massive clawed appendage shot through the bars. Not a paw but something with opposable digits ending in curved talons, each claw as long as my hand, gleaming black in the sunlight. It grasped blindly for me, the talons inches from my face as I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the loose gravel outside the cave. My Glock slipped from its holster, clattering to the ground just beyond the gate's reach, the metal glinting mockingly in the dirt. I couldn't retrieve it, not with those claws searching for purchase, the creature's wail rising from inside the cave. A sound that started like an animal in pain but morphed into something almost like speech, distorted syllables that made no sense but seemed shaped for communication. I didn't wait to analyze it. I ran, my legs pumping as I crashed through the woods, leaping over fallen logs, splashing through a small creek that soaked my boots, the cold water a shock against my skin. The forest blurred around me, the red maples and green pines a kaleidoscope of color as I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. I didn't slow down until my truck came into view in the small dirt parking area near the trailhead. Its faded blue paint a lifeline in the chaos. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice, the metal clinking against the gravel, before I managed to unlock the door. Once inside, I slammed the locks shut, my fingers fumbling as I stared back at the forest edge, half expecting to see that thing emerge from the trees, its green eyes glowing in the daylight. Nothing followed, just the normal sounds of birds and wind returning, as if the forest itself were pretending nothing had happened, a collective act of denial that made my stomach churn. I drove back to the ranger station with the windows up and the heat blasting, though it did nothing for the chill that had settled in my core, a cold that wasn't just physical but existential, a bone-deep certainty that I'd brushed against something I wasn't meant to see. I needed to report what I'd seen, to tell Davis or Wilson, but as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, I wondered what exactly I would say. A deformed bear? Some undocumented species? The rational part of my brain struggled to categorize it while another part, primal and raw, simply wanted to forget. Chapter 5: The Haunting Aftermath. That night in my small cabin at the edge of ranger housing, I sat with all the lights on, unable to sleep, the memory of those green eyes seared into my mind. The cabin was sparse, its wooden walls lined with shelves of field guides and maps. A single cot in the corner where I tossed my uniform after returning from the station. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's stretched neck, the way it moved. All wrong. Like something wearing a bear's skin without understanding how a bear should behave. The image jerked me back to wakefulness, my heart racing as I scanned the darkened windows, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me through the glass. I'd lost my gun, a serious breach of protocol, and I'd have to explain that to Davis. But more than that, I'd have to decide how much of the truth to tell about what I'd encountered in Ridgeline Cave. The next morning, I walked into the ranger station with a rehearsed story, practiced all night between failed attempts at sleep, each interrupted by visions of those toxic green eyes. Davis looked up from his computer as I knocked on his open office door. His reading glasses perched low on his nose, a stack of incident reports piled to his right. The small office smelled of coffee and old paperwork, a familiar scent that did little to ease the knot in my stomach. "Anderson, come in," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, the click of the latch loud in the quiet room. "Sir, I need to report an incident from yesterday." I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I was hiking near Ridgeline Point during my off hours and lost my service weapon. Davis removed his glasses, folding them carefully, his movements deliberate. "You lost your Glock? Where exactly?" "Near Ridgeline Cave, sir," I said, swallowing hard. "I encountered what I initially thought was a bear." His expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "The cave area has been restricted for years." "Yes, sir," I admitted, my weight shifting uncomfortably. I heard unusual sounds coming from inside, scratching, clicking. I was concerned it might be an injured animal. I paused, deciding how much to reveal. The gate had a gap at the bottom. I was able to slip through. Davis leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "So, you trespassed into a restricted area while off duty?" "Yes, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the guilt twisting in my gut. Inside, I found tracks that didn't match standard wildlife patterns. The toe configuration was wrong. 5 forward-facing digits, almost hand-like. Davis's tone remained flat, unyielding. Bear tracks can appear distorted in cave soil. Moisture, uneven surfaces. "With respect, sir, I know bear tracks," I countered, my frustration bubbling to the surface. These were something else. And what I saw in there, it wasn't a bear, not a normal one, anyway. "What exactly are you suggesting you saw, Anderson?" Davis's eyes narrowed, his gaze pinning me in place. I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane, the memory of the creature's movements flashing in my mind. It was bear-sized, but its proportions were wrong. The neck was too long, the head too small. Its movements were unnatural, and its eyes reflected green in my flashlight. Davis sighed heavily, the sound carrying the weight of his years in the service. "Sounds like a disoriented bear to me, possibly malnourished," explaining the unusual proportions. "Cave lighting plays tricks." "Sir, it charged me," I insisted, my voice rising despite myself. "I dropped my weapon while running, but the way it moved, Anderson..." Davis cut me off sharply, his tone brooking no argument. 20 years here. Never seen anything science can't explain. You know what we deal in? Verifiable facts, not impressions or feelings. He tapped his pen against the desk, the rhythm steady, deliberate, especially in official reports. I nodded, feeling my credibility slipping away with each word, the weight of his dismissal pressing down on me. "I'd like permission to retrieve my weapon," I said, my voice quieter now, resigned. "Denied," Davis replied without hesitation. "That area has new structural concerns. Recent geology surveys indicate possible instability. We'll be expanding the restricted zone next week. But your gun, we'll requisition you a replacement." He picked up a form and began filling it out, his handwriting precise, unhurried. "I'd advise you to stick to authorized areas in the future, especially when off-duty. You're lucky you only lost a gun and not your life to a disoriented bear." I knew further argument was pointless. Davis had already settled on his explanation, one that fit neatly into the world as he understood it. I nodded and left his office, the image of that creature's impossible movements replaying in my head, a loop I couldn't escape. The nightmares started that same night, vivid and unrelenting. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the memory of green eyes following me through dark tunnels so vivid I had to check all my closets before I could calm down. the flashlight in my hand trembling as I swept its beam across the cabin's sparse interior. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, and I'd sit on my porch until dawn, a mug of coffee clutched in my hands, watching the tree lean as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. After a week of this, I requested a schedule change, unable to bear the thought of patrolling the northern sector where Ridgeline Cave loomed like a silent threat. When Wilson asked why, I gave her a vague excuse about wanting more visitor interaction, but the truth that I couldn't stand the thought of being near that cave felt too much like admitting weakness, a crack in the facade I'd built over 4 years as a ranger. "You're on the Pinewood Loop now," Wilson told me, sliding the new rotation schedule across the break room table, her eyes studying me with a scrutiny that made me shift uncomfortably. "Busy area, lots of families." "Perfect," I said, relief washing over me as I scanned the schedule. Pinewood was the opposite direction from Ridgeline, a bustling campground surrounded by people, the kind of place where the sounds of laughter and crackling campfires drowned out the silence of the deep woods. "Safe." Wilson studied me for a moment too long, her gaze sharp. "You seem different lately." "Just tired," I answered too quickly, my fingers tightening around my coffee mug. "Does this have anything to do with that bear report from Ridgeline?" she asked, her voice casual but her eyes piercing. I stared at my coffee, the dark liquid swirling in the mug. "Just ready for a change," I said, avoiding her gaze. She nodded, not pushing further, but I could tell she wasn't convinced, her silence heavier than any question. Night shifts became my personal hell, each one a gauntlet of fear I couldn't escape. Every snapping branch made me flinch, my hand instinctively reaching for my new Glock, the weight of it a cold comfort against my hip. Every shadow moved in my peripheral vision, a trick of the light that sent my heart racing, my flashlight beam darting through the darkness in search of those green eyes. The other rangers noticed, their comments starting as jokes. "Jumpy today, Anderson?" but growing into concerned glances and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the air thick with their unspoken worry. 3 weeks after the incident, Davis called me into his office again, his expression stern as he sat behind his desk, a manila folder open in front of him. "Park administration has some concerns," he said without preamble, his voice flat. "Your behavior has been erratic. Requisition for extra flashlights, requesting only daylight shifts, jumping at noises during briefings." I kept my face neutral, my hands clasped in my lap. "I'm fine, sir," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Nevertheless, they're mandating a psychological evaluation before you continue fieldwork," he replied, sliding a card across his desk. "Dr. Simmons, tomorrow at 9. Dr. Simmons's office smelled of vanilla and old books, the walls lined with degrees and nature photographs. A serene lake at sunrise, a deer grazing in a meadow that did little to ease the tension coiling in my chest. She was a petite woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her voice professional but kind as she gestured for me to sit. "Tell me about the incident at Ridgeline Cave," she said, her pen poised over a notepad. I gave her the sanitized version, the one Davis preferred. A restricted area, a possible bear, dropping my weapon while retreating. "And this has affected your sleep?" she noted, her pen scratching against the paper. "Wouldn't you be startled if a bear charged you in a dark cave?" I asked, forcing a weak smile. She returned it, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yes, I would. But most rangers I've worked with process such encounters differently. They don't request immediate reassignment or avoid entire sectors of the park." I shifted in the too-soft chair, the fabric creaking beneath me. "Look, I know what this evaluation is for. You need to clear me for duty. What I need," she said gently, setting her notepad down, "is to understand what's really bothering you, Mark, off the record." I studied her face, searching for judgment and finding none, her expression open, inviting. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The impossible creature, the way it moved, those eyes that haunted my dreams. But I'd seen how Davis reacted, how quickly he'd dismissed me. I knew how it would sound, how it would label me. "I got spooked in the dark," I finally said, my voice low, defeated. Imagination ran wild. Been working too many hours, that's all. Dr. Simmons didn't look convinced, her brow furrowing slightly, but she nodded slowly. Well, that's something we can work with. I'm clearing you for duty, but I'd like to see you weekly for a while to help with the sleep issues. I agreed, knowing this was the price of keeping my job, the cost of shrinking my experience into something that fit within normal parameters. But normal didn't exist for me anymore, not after what I'd seen in that cave. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Child. In the months that followed, I sought refuge in the town library, a small brick building on the edge of Blackwood County with an impressive local history section. The library smelled of dust and aged paper, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and yellowed newspapers, a treasure trove of the past that offered a distraction from my nightmares. I started spending my days off there, digging through old newspapers and journals, telling myself I was being thorough, researching regional wildlife anomalies. The truth was more desperate. I needed to know if anyone else had seen what I saw, if the thing in the cave had left its mark on others before me. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Harper, a woman with a kind smile and glasses that hung on a chain around her neck, noticed my frequent visits. "You're the ranger, right?" she asked after my fourth visit, her voice soft as she approached the table where I sat, surrounded by open books and a notepad filled with scribbled dates. "Looking for anything specific?" I hesitated, my pen hovering over the page. "Local legends," I admitted, my voice low. "Unusual animal sightings, maybe strange encounters in the woods. Older records if you have them." She smiled knowingly, a glint in her eye as she adjusted her glasses. "I have just the thing." She disappeared into the back room, returning with a box of leather-bound journals, their covers cracked with age, the pages brittle under my fingers. "Original settler accounts from the 1880s, she said, setting the box on the table. "Not cataloged in our system yet. Most people find them boring, but I thought you might appreciate them." I thanked her, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the first journal. The ink faded but still legible, the handwriting a looping script that spoke of a time long past. Most entries detailed mundane pioneer life, crop yields, weather patterns, illnesses that swept through small communities. But scattered throughout were passages that made my blood run cold. A trapper in 1883 described losing his hunting dog near a cave system, the animal reappearing 3 days later but not right, refusing to eat, sitting and staring with eyes all wrong, until the trapper was forced to put her down when she tried to bite his son. A settler in 1887 wrote of his child, Tommy, claiming to have met himself in the woods, a mirror image that looked just like him but didn't talk right, repeating Tommy's words in a voice that sent the boy running home in tears. The most detailed account came from a missionary in 1891, who documented local Native American warnings about forest mimics, creatures that learned by watching, that wore faces not their own, blending into the human world until they chose to reveal themselves. I copied pages until my hand cramped, building a file that felt both ridiculous and vital, a collection of evidence I couldn't share with anyone at the station. They'd already thought I was unstable after the cave incident. This would only confirm their suspicions. Winter turned to spring, the snow melting into muddy trails, and my nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. I settled into my new routine of Pinewood patrols, psychological sessions where I said only what was needed to be cleared, and private research that consumed my every free moment. The cave incident gradually faded from station gossip, replaced by routine park emergencies and visitor drama. Lost hikers, campfire violations, the occasional bear sighting that fit neatly into the expected patterns. By summer, I could almost convince myself it had been a bear, a deformed, sick bear that my frightened mind had transformed into something more sinister. Almost. Then came that Tuesday in June, 6 months after Ridgeline Cave, a day that shattered the fragile normalcy I'd built. I was marking a new trail junction near Oak Meadow, a quiet section of the park where the trees grew tall and the ground was carpeted with pine needles, their scent sharp in the morning air. I drove a wooden stake into the soil, a bright orange flag tied to its top, when movement caught my eye. 20 yards away, partially hidden by underbrush, stood a small figure. A boy, maybe 10 years old, standing perfectly still in the clearing. Too still. He wore a blue button-up shirt and khaki shorts that looked freshly pressed, despite being 4 miles from any campsite in an area thick with mud from yesterday's rain. His brown loafers were spotless, not a speck of dirt on them, an impossibility in the soggy forest. I approached slowly, my hand instinctively moving to my holster, the weight of my Glock a cold reassurance against my hip. "Hey there, you okay?" I called, my voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. The boy turned his head with mechanical precision, his posture unnaturally rigid, his eyes meeting mine without blinking. "I'm Eric," he said, his voice flat, emotionless, as if reading from a script. "I'm hiking with my family." Every instinct in my body screamed danger, a primal warning that made my pulse quicken. His posture remained frozen, like a mannequin propped among the pines, and even as a breeze rustled through the underbrush, his clothes stayed perfectly still. Not a wrinkle, not a hair out of place. "Hey, Eric," I said, keeping my tone casual despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. "Where is your family right now?" His head rotated to maintain eye contact as I stepped sideways, the movement precise, mechanical, like the second hand of a clock ticking. "Where is your family right now?" he repeated, using my exact intonation, his voice a perfect echo of mine. I moved closer, scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of adults, my senses on high alert. The nearest trail junction was 2 miles back, and this section of Oak Meadow rarely saw visitors due to its distance from parking areas. "How long have you been out here?" I asked, watching his face for any sign of reaction. His expression never changed, his eyes fixed on me with unwavering attention, like a predator tracking prey. "How long have you been out here?" he parroted, the words immediate, without hesitation. The kid hadn't blinked once since I'd spotted him, his gaze unyielding, and there was something else about those eyes. They seemed older than the body they belonged to, carrying a weight that didn't belong to a child. "Are you lost?" I tried again, my voice softer now, coaxing. "Are you lost?" he echoed, his tone a mirror of mine. I pulled my canteen from my belt, the metal cool against my palm. "Are you thirsty? Want some water?" I extended the bottle toward him, watching for any sign of normal human response. Eric looked at it without moving, not even raising his arms to accept it. "Want some water?" he repeated, his voice flat, mechanical. When I set the canteen on the ground between us, he didn't reach for it, didn't even acknowledge it was there, his gaze never leaving mine. The muddy forest floor had soaked everything within miles after yesterday's downpour. Pine needles sticking to my boots, my pants splattered with dirt halfway up my calves. Yet Eric's shoes remained pristine, as if he'd been placed here, untouched by the elements. I took a step back and unclipped my radio, my movements deliberate. "Dispatch, this is Anderson," I said, the crackle of static loud in the quiet clearing. "Go ahead, Anderson," came the reply. "I'm at Oak Meadow Junction, grid marker 7. I've encountered a minor, approximately 10 years old, separated from his family, requesting assistance." "Copy that. Wilson is already in Sector 6. I'll redirect her to your location. ETA 15 minutes. The dispatcher responded. 10-4, I said, my eyes never leaving the boy. Eric's head tilted slightly, an unnatural angle that made my skin crawl. 10-4, he repeated, his mouth forming the words with a precision that felt rehearsed, practiced. I clipped the radio back to my belt, forcing a smile. "Let's wait here for Ranger Wilson, okay? She'll help us find your family. Let's wait here for Ranger Wilson, okay? She'll help us find your family?" He echoed, perfectly matching my rhythm and tone, his voice a chilling mimicry. I tried another approach, desperate for any real response. "What are your parents' names? What are your parents' names?" he parroted. "Where were you camping? Where were you camping?" Each answer came immediately, without any processing time, as if there were no thought behind his responses, just perfect mimicry. I sat down on a fallen log about 10 feet away, keeping him in full view, my hand resting near my holster. "So, Eric, do you like hiking?" His eyes followed me down, unblinking. "So, Eric, do you like hiking? Have you been to Blackwood Park before? Have you been to Blackwood Park before?" This continued for nearly 15 minutes. Me asking questions, him repeating them verbatim. His voice a mirror that reflected nothing of himself. Throughout our one-sided conversation, he never moved from his original spot, never sat, never leaned against a tree, never showed any signs of fatigue or boredom that you'd expect from a child. His stillness was unnatural, a statue carved in the shape of a boy, and I noticed another oddity. Despite standing in dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, Eric cast almost no shadow, the light seeming to bend around him in ways that defied physics, as if he were a void in the world. The crackle of a radio announced Wilson's approach before I saw her emerge from the trail to the west, her boots crunching against the pine needles, her expression shifting from professional concern to subtle unease as she took in the scene. "Hey!" she greeted me, keeping her voice low as she approached, her eyes flicking to the boy. "This our lost kid?" I nodded, standing up, my muscles tense. "Says his name is Eric. No last name. Won't or can't tell me where his family is. Just repeats everything I say." Wilson studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing as she took in his pristine clothes, his unyielding stare. "Hey there, Eric," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "I'm Ranger Wilson. We're going to help you find your family. Okay? I'm Ranger Wilson. We're going to help you find your family. Okay?" Eric repeated, his voice a perfect echo of hers. Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. She turned to me, her voice low. "How long has he been doing that?" "Since I found him," I said, glancing back at Eric. "He doesn't answer questions, doesn't accept water, doesn't seem distressed at all. And look how clean his clothes are. After yesterday's rain, that's impossible." Wilson nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the boy. "I've got protocol cards in my pack for handling minors. Let me grab them." She moved a few steps away and began digging through her backpack, her movements quick but deliberate. I turned back toward Eric, ready to ask another question, but the clearing was empty. The spot where he'd stood was bare, the pine needles undisturbed, as if he'd never been there. "Wilson," I called sharply, my voice cutting through the quiet. "He's gone." We both spun around, scanning the dense trees surrounding us, the air suddenly heavy with tension. "That's impossible," Wilson muttered, her hand resting on her own holster. I didn't look away for more than 3 seconds. We split up, circling the clearing in opposite directions, our boots crunching against the forest floor as we searched for any sign of the boy. There were no footprints leading away from where Eric had stood, no broken branches, no sound of someone running through the underbrush, nothing to indicate he'd ever been there. "Anderson, over here," Wilson called, her voice tight. She stood at the edge of the clearing, pointing at something partially hidden by ferns. A small backpack, faded blue canvas with leather straps, its surface worn and cracked as if it had aged decades in the damp forest. It hadn't been there minutes earlier. I was certain of it. I pulled on a pair of latex gloves from my pack, the rubber snapping against my wrists, and carefully picked up the bag, the material stiff and brittle under my fingers, as if it might crumble at any moment. When I opened the main compartment, I found neatly folded children's clothing, a small wool sweater, corduroy pants, and a cap, all in styles I hadn't seen outside of history books, their stitching and fabric reminiscent of the 1950s. "These look vintage," Wilson said, peering over my shoulder, her voice tinged with unease. "Like 1950s era." At the bottom of the bag lay a small notebook bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with symbols that resembled writing but matched no alphabet I recognized. Sharp, angular marks that seemed to shift as I looked at them, reorganizing themselves when I turned the pages, as if the text were alive, adapting to my gaze. "What the hell is going on?" Wilson whispered, her voice barely audible. I closed the notebook, a sudden reluctance to examine it further washing over me, the symbols burning into my memory like a brand. "We need to expand the search," I said, my voice firm despite the fear coiling in my gut. Get additional rangers out here. Within an hour, 3 search teams combed the area, their radios crackling with updates as they covered a 5-mile radius, checking every trail, ravine, and potential hiding place. Wilson transported the backpack to the station for documentation, her expression grim as she drove off. We found no sign of Eric, no footprints, no broken branches, no evidence anyone had passed through the forest except us. When I returned to the station that evening, Chief Davis was waiting, the backpack sealed in an evidence bag on his desk, its faded blue canvas stark against the plastic. No visitor passes issued to any family with a boy matching that description, he said without preamble, his voice flat. No vehicles in any lot registered to an owner with a son named Eric. No camping reservations under similar names. Did you check missing persons? I asked, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. Davis nodded, his expression unreadable. Nothing recent that matches. But the clothing in this bag. He tapped the evidence bag, the sound sharp in the quiet office. Textile expert from the university says it's authentic 1950s manufacturing, not reproduction. And the notebook is being analyzed. Initial assessment is that the symbols don't correspond to any known language. Davis fixed me with a hard stare, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. What exactly did you see out there, Anderson? I thought about those unblinking eyes, the perfectly clean clothes, the way Eric had disappeared in seconds when our attention wavered. A boy who wasn't acting like a boy, I said finally, my voice low. Something was wrong with him. The way he moved, spoke, it wasn't natural. Davis was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the desk, the rhythm steady, deliberate. The backpack will go into evidence, he said at last. I've sealed this incident under restricted access. Sir, with respect, if there's a child in the park. I began, but Davis cut me off, his voice sharp. No child disappearances have been reported. No evidence suggests this Eric is in any danger. For now, we document and monitor. As I walked to my cabin that night, the weight in my chest grew heavier, a fear that wasn't about not finding Eric, but the possibility that we might find him again, or whatever was wearing his shape. I spent that night checking and rechecking my locks, the sound of my own breathing loud in the quiet cabin, convincing myself the tapping at my window was just pine branches in the wind. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw Eric's unblinking stare, and I wondered what had been looking out at me from behind those eyes, what had been watching me all along. Chapter 7, The Watcher's Game. 3 weeks after the Eric incident, I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night, each attempt at rest interrupted by dreams of blank stares and perfect stillness, my mind replaying that mechanical voice on a loop. I'd requested a transfer to Pinewood Sector, telling myself it was because I needed more visitor contact and fewer remote patrols. But the truth was simpler. I couldn't bear the thought of being near Ridgeline Cave, couldn't face the northern sector where those green eyes might still be waiting. The radio call came during my morning coffee, the mug warm in my hands as I sat on my porch, watching the sun rise over the treeline, its golden light doing little to warm the chill that had settled in my bones. Anderson, we've got a code atom at Pinewood Campsite, Site 42. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. 7-year-old female, last seen approximately 90 minutes ago. I set my mug down hard enough to splash coffee onto the table, the dark liquid pooling on the wood as my heart sank. Copy that. En route, 8 minutes, I replied, my voice steady despite the dread coiling in my gut. Code Atom, a missing child, was my least favorite call, a gut-wrenching reminder of the park's dangers, but it demanded absolute priority, a race against time that left no room for hesitation. I grabbed my go bag, a sturdy canvas pack stocked with emergency blankets, first aid supplies, water and protein bars, and ran to my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots as I moved. The drive to Pinewood Campsite took 6 minutes instead of 8. My foot heavy on the gas as I navigated the winding park roads, the trees blurring past in a haze of green and brown. I pulled into the gravel lot where 3 ranger vehicles already idled, their lights flashing red and blue against the morning light, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Wilson stood by her truck, organizing a group of junior rangers into search teams, her movements brisk, efficient. "Anderson?" She nodded as I approached, her voice clipped but calm. "Lily Mason, 7 years old, brown hair, green eyes, approximately 45 pounds. Last seen wearing pink pajama pants and a white t-shirt with a unicorn design. No shoes. Parents?" I asked, scanning the growing crowd of concerned campers gathering at the edge of the site, their faces pale, their voices a low murmur of worry. "Over there." Wilson pointed toward a picnic table where a woman sat hunched over, her body racked with sobs, her hands clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. A tall man stood several feet away, talking to Ranger Mitchell, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. "Mother's Sarah, father's Robert," he reported it. Said the girl wandered off during breakfast while he was packing up their tent. I nodded and headed toward the parents, pausing at the search gear station to grab a handheld GPS unit, its screen glowing with a map of the area. Something about the father's posture made me uncomfortable before I even reached him. He stood too straight, too composed for a man whose daughter had been missing for nearly 2 hours, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were watching for something other than his child. Sarah Mason looked up as I approached, her face blotchy and swollen, mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivers, her hands twisting the stuffed rabbit's fur so tightly her knuckles were white. "Mrs. Mason?" I said, crouching to her eye level, my voice gentle but firm. "I'm Ranger Anderson. I'm going to help find Lily." She nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling over, her voice breaking as she spoke. She never goes off alone. She's careful. She knows the rules." Her fingers tightened on the rabbit, a small worn toy with one ear flopping over, its fabric faded from years of love. "This is her favorite bunny. She'd never leave him behind. Never." I made a mental note of the detail. Children rarely wandered far without their comfort objects, a fact that narrowed the search radius but deepened my unease. "Did Lily sleep well last night? Was she upset about anything?" I asked, keeping my tone soft, coaxing. Sarah shook her head, her breath hitching. "She was fine, Happy. We made s'mores last night. She was excited about hiking to the waterfall today." I turned toward Robert Mason, who had finished speaking with Mitchell and now stood watching our conversation from several feet away, his face betraying no distress, not a hint of the panic you'd expect from a father whose child had been missing for nearly 2 hours. "Mr. Mason," I said, straightening up, my eyes meeting his, "can you walk me through exactly what happened this morning?" He nodded once, his movements precise, almost mechanical. "We woke around 7, he said, his voice steady, emotionless. "Sarah started breakfast. I began packing up our gear. Lily was still in her pajamas, sitting at the picnic table coloring. I went to take down the tent. When I came back 10 minutes later, she was gone." His eyes fixed on mine with a strange intensity, maintaining unbroken contact, and there was something deeply unsettling about his stare, a hollowness behind it that sparked a memory, a chilling echo of Eric's unblinking gaze from weeks ago. "Did you call for her?" I asked, watching his face for any flicker of emotion. "Of course," he replied immediately, without the hesitation of recollection, his voice flat. "We searched the immediate area, then the restrooms. Sarah checked with neighboring campsites while I searched the trailhead. That's when I radioed for assistance." Everything he said sounded reasonable, textbook, even the kind of response you'd expect from a parent following protocol. But something in his delivery felt rehearsed, as if he were reciting lines he'd memorized rather than reliving the terror of losing his child. I glanced at Sarah, still clutching the stuffed rabbit, her devastation a stark contrast to Robert's eerie calm, the two of them existing in different emotional realities. "And Lily has no history of wandering off, no incidents of hiding as a game?" I pressed, my eyes flicking between them. "No," Robert answered, the same second Sarah said, "Never," her voice a broken whisper. I nodded and stepped away to join Wilson, who was coordinating with the newly arrived K-9 unit, their dogs pacing eagerly, noses to the ground. "Something's off with the father," I murmured to her, keeping my voice low as I glanced back at Robert. "Yeah, I noticed," she replied, her eyes narrowing as she followed my gaze. Too composed. "It's not just that," I said, hesitating, unsure how to explain the connection I felt to the Eric incident without sounding paranoid. "The way he stares. It reminds me of something." Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't press for details, her focus shifting to the search operation. "We've got 4 search teams ready to deploy. Standard grid pattern from the last known position. K9 has a scent item, a pillow from her sleeping bag." I studied the growing search operation, 24 rangers and volunteers gathering, checking radio equipment and reviewing trail maps. Their movements a well-oiled machine honed by decades of protocol. In normal circumstances, I'd have complete confidence in our ability to find Lily before nightfall, the park's search and rescue system one of the best in the region. But these didn't feel like normal circumstances. The memory of Eric's disappearance a shadow that loomed over this new case, whispering warnings I couldn't ignore. "I'm going to talk to the father again," I told Wilson, my voice firm. "Something doesn't add up." As I turned back toward the Masons' campsite, I caught Robert adjusting something beneath his jacket. A quick, subtle movement that sent another chill down my spine. He dropped his hand instantly when he noticed my attention, his expression unchanged, but the gesture lingered in my mind, a puzzle piece I couldn't yet place. For the next hour, I interviewed adjacent campers while keeping Robert in my peripheral vision, my senses on high alert. No one had seen Lily that morning, their accounts a frustrating litany of nothing unusual. But 3 separate campers mentioned hearing an argument from the Mason site around dawn, though none could make out the words, the raised voices muffled by the distance and the morning mist. By mid-afternoon, search teams had covered a 2-mile radius without result, their radios crackling with negative reports that deepened the knot in my stomach. Sarah's distress had intensified, her sobs turning to gasps as she struggled to breathe, her hands still clutching the stuffed rabbit as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. I made a decision, approaching her again with a gentle touch on her shoulder. "Mrs. Mason," I said, my voice soft but firm, "we're bringing in additional resources for the search, including thermal imaging equipment. Protocol suggests we take you to the station where you'll be more comfortable and can speak with our support personnel." "I can't leave," she gasped, her eyes wild with panic. "What if she comes back? What if she's looking for me?" "Rangers will remain at the campsite," I assured her, my tone steady. "And your husband can stay if he prefers." I caught Robert's eye as I said this, watching for any reaction. Something flickered across his face, the tiniest break in his mask of composure, a fleeting shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "That would be best," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "I should stay here in case Lily returns." I nodded to 2 junior rangers, their faces serious as they stepped forward. "Please escort Mrs. Mason to the station. Make sure she gets water and something to eat." As they guided Sarah to a vehicle, her sobs echoing through the campsite, I noticed Robert watching them leave with an odd intensity, his hand again moving toward whatever he kept concealed under his jacket. The gesture quick but deliberate, a warning I couldn't ignore. Darkness approached rapidly, the way it always does in the mountains, the light fading to a deep indigo as the temperature dropped, the air growing sharp with the promise of night. Search teams regrouped, switching to night operations, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades, the beams reflecting off the dew on the grass. The K9 units had lost the scent at a stream half a mile east of the campsite, the water's flow washing away any trace of Lily, leaving thermal imaging as our best hope now. I was checking battery packs for the night vision equipment, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal, when Robert appeared at my side, moving so quietly I hadn't heard his approach, his presence a sudden weight beside me. "Ranger Anderson," he said, his voice unervingly steady, his eyes fixed on mine with that same hollow intensity. "There's something I need to show you in the woods." I straightened slowly, my hand resting near my holster, the Glock a cold reassurance against my hip. "What kind of something, Mr. Mason?" I asked, my voice careful, measured. "I found tracks earlier," he said, his expression perfectly still as he spoke. I didn't mention them because I wasn't sure, but I think they might be Lily's. We have trained trackers on our team, I replied, my eyes narrowing as I studied him. If you point out the location... No. He cut me off, his voice sharp, an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I need to show you specifically. It's not far. Every instinct warned me against following this man alone into the darkening forest. The weight of his stare, his unnatural calmness, the way he'd concealed something under his jacket, all of it screamed danger, a chorus of alarm bells ringing in my mind. But if there was even a remote chance he knew something about Lily's whereabouts, I couldn't dismiss it, couldn't let my fear override my duty. Let me grab my pack, I said, stepping back toward my truck, my movements deliberate as I reached for my radio, pretending to check its battery while actually keying the mic. Dispatch, Anderson here, I said, my voice steady. Heading east of Pinewood Site 42 with Robert Mason to check possible tracks. We'll maintain radio contact. Copy that, Anderson. Check in every 15 minutes, came the response. I unsnapped my holster as I turned back to Robert, making the movement casual but deliberate, ensuring he saw the Glock at my side. His eyes flickered down to the weapon briefly, then back to my face, his expression unchanged. Lead the way, Mr. Mason, I said, my voice firm. As he turned toward the tree line, I thought again of Eric's unblinking stare from 3 weeks ago, the same emptiness lurking behind Robert's eyes. Whatever connection existed between these two incidents, I was about to walk directly into it. The woods consumed us as we moved further from the search operation, the sounds of radios and shouting fading into the distance, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches in the evening breeze. Robert walked with unusual certainty through the deepening shadows, never hesitating at trail junctions or pausing to get his bearings. His movements fluid, almost predatory, a grace that contradicted what you'd expect from a distressed father. Each step took us farther from the comforting presence of other rangers, the forest closing in around us like a living thing, its shadows stretching long and thin in the fading light. How much farther to these tracks? I asked after 5 minutes, my voice sounding tight even to my ears, my hand resting near my holster. Just ahead, Robert replied without turning around, his voice flat, emotionless. There's a small clearing where I found them. His unwavering confidence troubled me. Most civilians lost in these woods became disoriented quickly, especially under stress, their steps hesitant, their eyes darting to landmarks. Robert moved like someone who'd memorized the path, his stride sure, deliberate. The narrow trail curved around a large boulder, its surface covered in moss that glowed faintly in the moonlight, and opened into a small clearing, the forest floor carpeted with pine needles, silver patches of moonlight filtering through the canopy above. Robert stopped in the center and turned to face me, the shadows accentuating the hollowness of his eyes, his face a mask of stillness that made my stomach churn. "This is where you found the tracks?" I asked, scanning the ground with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but undisturbed soil. No indentations, no sign of a child's bare feet, no evidence of anything at all. Robert's lips pulled into a tight smile, the expression too wide, too still, a mirror of the smile I'd seen on Eric weeks earlier, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My daughter isn't actually missing," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any parental emotion. My hand instinctively moved toward my holstered weapon, my fingers brushing the grip of the Glock. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "She was never here," he said, his tone unchanged, as if discussing the weather. "None of us were ever really here." Before I could process his words, Robert's hand emerged from his jacket, gripping a hunting knife with a blade that caught the moonlight, its edge gleaming with a cold, deadly promise. In one fluid motion, too fast for normal human reflexes, he lunged forward, the knife plunging into my abdomen with a force that drove the air from my lungs. Pain erupted across my stomach, a sensation both burning and ice-cold, radiating outward from the point of impact, a white-hot agony that made my vision blur. I stumbled backward, my brain struggling to catch up with what had just happened. My hand pressing against the wound, warm wetness spreading beneath my fingers, the metallic scent of blood filling the air. "What?" I gasped, my voice a ragged whisper as I tried to make sense of the betrayal, the violence. Robert advanced without hesitation, his movements jerky yet precise, like a predator that had studied human movement but couldn't quite replicate it naturally. His face expressionless despite the violence of his actions. I tried to draw my weapon, my fingers fumbling with the holster, but he struck again, the knife slashing across my arm, a fresh wave of pain that made me cry out, the sound echoing through the clearing. I crashed into a tree trunk, using it for momentary support, the rough bark biting into my back as the forest spun around me. Darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision as shock began to set in. Robert kept coming, his face a mask of calm, his eyes fixed on mine with that same hollow intensity. "You Rangers always notice too much," he said, his voice modulating strangely on certain syllables, as if struggling to maintain the illusion of humanity. "Always watching, recording, searching. The others wanted to wait, but I told them we needed to act now." He swung the knife again with impossible strength, the blade slicing through the air where my head had been a moment before. I managed to dodge, rolling to the side, but the movement sent fresh agony through my abdomen, my blood soaking my uniform shirt, disturbingly warm against my rapidly cooling skin. "Others," I choked out, partly from pain and partly to keep him talking, buying time as I fumbled for my sidearm, my fingers slick with blood. "We've been here since before your kind named these woods," Robert continued, circling me with unnatural patience, his movements deliberate, predatory. "We learn, we watch, we become." My fingers finally closed around my Glock, the grip cold and solid in my hand. With every ounce of remaining strength, I pulled it free and fired, the shot echoing through the clearing, a deafening crack that made my ears ring. Robert jerked as the bullet struck his chest, but his expression never changed. No pain, no surprise, just a mild curiosity as he looked down at the spreading darkness on his shirt, the blood black in the moonlight. I fired again and again, 3 shots total, center mass, exactly as training dictated, each recoil sending a jolt of pain through my wounded body. Robert stumbled backward, collapsing to his knees, then onto his back, his body motionless on the forest floor, blood pooling beneath him, a dark mirror reflecting the moonlight. But he was smiling, that same too wide, too still,